Thank you very much, and welcome to this panel debate on online political polarization. Which knowledge breakthroughs do we need in order to understand it? And my name is Erik Olsson, and I'm a professor of theoretical philosophy here in Lund. We are all at Lund University, by the way. And here on my side, here on the left of me, is lecturer Anamaria Dutceac Segesten from European Studies. She will co-moderate this event with me. And we also have as speakers Michael Bossetta, who is a researcher in media and communication studies, and Nils Gustafsson, you are a researcher in strategic communication, and Hanna Bäck, who is a professor in political science, all again from Lund University. So I will say a few words before we start with the talks. So I should say that all participants here have been involved in the theme group at the Pufendorf Institute on political polarization on the internet. So we have been meeting regularly for quite some time, and we have discussed these and other things quite extensively together. There were also other members in this theme group who don't present today, but some of them are here in the audience instead. So I think that this is a great opportunity for us in our theme group to discuss and share some of the things we have been debating in the group with a wider audience. And what we present today are hypotheses, concepts, and mostly preliminary, sometimes very preliminary results that we have that we intend to further develop in subgroups within this Pufendorf theme. And I see it as open-ended research that is still to be concluded, so it's not finished work that we're presenting, but more things that we would like to think will stimulate discussion on this very timely and important topic. And the structure of this event will be after this introduction that each panel member has his or her floor for about 5 minutes, giving a talk very briefly on their own research on this. And then we will have questions and answers from the two moderators, from me and from Anamaria, and then questions from the audience, and perhaps also questions from the audience on Zoom. Let's see what happens, and then we wrap up and say goodbye after that. So that's the structure. But now Anamaria will also say a few words.
Yes, it's my pleasure again to welcome everybody, both digitally and physically, to this event. My name is Anamaria Segesten, and I was a co-chair of the Pufendorf team. And my role here is maybe to set the stage for why political polarization and the internet are important and interesting things to study together. And I will not talk too much because this will obviously be apparent from the panelists themselves, but I will just situate this in a recent news context, namely the Facebook Whistleblower. Maybe some of you here have heard of this event at the beginning of October, basically 2 weeks ago. Francis Hogan, if I pronounce that correctly, revealed some interesting things happening at Facebook. And there are many things we can pick up on, but there's maybe 3 for us relevant issues. We know through her that Facebook is aware that only a small fraction of misinformation and disinformation that is published on the platform is captured by their human and automatic filters. I think when it comes to COVID anti-vaccination, only 10 to 20% of that information is being identified and pulled down by Facebook. We also know that Facebook abandoned some efforts to cut down on misinformation after the presidential election in the United States was officially ended, and also knows that Instagram may cause some negative effect on young users. So these are the things that were apparent from the disclosures made by Hogan. And one of the examples that maybe is relevant for us dealing with politics here comes from the congressional hearings, and I almost quote from her words. She gave the example of how Facebook's recommender algorithm would increase the spread of disinformation. If a new user signed up and followed Donald Trump's Facebook page, it wouldn't be long before the platform's algorithm was pushing this user QAnon conspiracy theories. So that's a way in which this kind of mechanisms would work. So our event today shows the importance, or wants to demonstrate the importance of Facebook, by extension social media, and even by further extension the online space, to affect the type of information and even the opinions and feelings that people have towards political and social issues. On the other hand, things are a little bit more complicated. Obviously, that's why we're researchers. It could be perhaps too easy to blame it all on the internet, right? And I will refer to this Facebook whistleblower event and quote maybe someone unexpected, namely Nick Clegg, former UK politician and current VP at Facebook, who in a CNN interview discussed directly the role of polarization and social media. A journalist asked whether Facebook would be responsible for the divisions that led to the January 6th insurrection in the United States. These are the words of the reporter. And Clegg responded, "I think it gives people false comfort to assume that there must be a technological or a technical explanation for the issues of political polarization in the United States." And again, we'll discuss more how much US and how much Sweden can this go for. The reporter comes back, "Well, you think it's too easy to say that it's Facebook's fault?" And Clegg replies, "Well, I think it would be too easy, surely, to suggest that with a tweak to an algorithm, somehow all the disfiguring polarization in US politics would suddenly evaporate. I think it absolves people of asking themselves the harder questions about the historical, cultural, social, and economic reasons that have led to the politics that we have in the US today." So this is the interesting thing. Like, we see definitely something that happens online and that is or may be connected to polarization, but we also hear this type of opinion that maybe we should look even broader. So this is kind of the setup of the discussion today. I hope that this small event, media event, brought it even more to the surface for you. So now I'm ready to pass the mic symbolically to my colleague, my absent colleague. Unfortunately, Mikael Klintman cannot be present with us today, but we nevertheless wanted to represent his points of view. And as a consequence, my colleague Erik, whose research lies very closely aligned to Mikael, will present some of the information that Mikael intended to share with us all. So Mikael, Erik, the double hats are now switched. So please.
So now I switch from being a moderator to being one of the speakers. Yeah. So Michael had made very nice slides, so we thought it would be a shame if we didn't show his fantastic pictures, and I will accompany them with some random remarks. But this is a picture that we have found helpful when dealing with, when discussing polarization, because polarization is a tricky word. I mean, we might polarize in various ways, and therefore we thought that it's a good thing. And apparently Mikael also thought it is a good thing to separate at least three kinds of polarization. So we have over there we have knowledge or belief polarization. So that's where beliefs come apart, as it were. But we can also have affective polarization. That's more what happens when people start disliking the other group very strongly. So you can have very strong affective polarization in that sense. And finally, we have ideological polarization, which is slightly more difficult to define because ideology itself is one of the more contested terms in political science. But at least it seems to us to be separate from the other two. So it's more kind of political polarization, that kind of thing. So here are a few things that we think would be also interesting to mention. So one thesis that we are, at least aiming to substantiate is the following: that merely providing more and better data in controversial issues may actually increase knowledge and belief polarization, if we start with that kind of polarization. And there's a long list of reasons why this is the case, and I can't go into all of them, and probably Mikael would have done a much better job in doing that. But basically, you interpret data often against the background of your own background beliefs. So if you have a certain kind of background belief, that will determine how you view the so-called facts, and you might interpret them very differently depending on what your background beliefs are. And that's one reason why we think this is probably the case. So providing more and better data or heuristics is powerful in itself. That's something we as power. So we go on to another claim that we want to make, that creating an organizing structure for knowledge-based deliberations between people with opposite knowledge beliefs reduces polarization. That's also a common claim which we want to contest. Here are a few reasons for why we think that social media is unfortunately very well suited for knowledge and belief polarization. So one fact is that on social media there's many places for one-liners, impulsive opinions and brief stories, and less for nuanced reasoning. So this we think is one reason to think that social media will be a kind of have a special place in the causes for polarization. But there's a lot of literature on this, and it goes a little back and forth, but this seems to be a rather stable idea nevertheless. And also initiating and spreading false claims is far less risky and more likely to be socially rewarding on social media than throughout history. So usually, I mean, when you have spread falsehood in your community, you have run some kind of risk of being detected and perhaps also punished for that. And we believe that that's less likely in many cases in social media. That might be one thing that actually also drives polarization online in a distinctive way, which is different, perhaps not in kind, but at least in terms of quality on social media. And then we can also discuss various ways of reducing this kind of polarization. And here I don't want to go into details because this is more Mikael Klintman's work. But he believes, and I tend to agree, that you can also reframe an issue in a way which reduces polarization. So let's give you just one example of this before I proceed to the next speaker. But as in terms of vaccination, perhaps you can reframe from poisonous shot to friendly intelligence service or something like that, and you get a different spin to the whole thing, so it can make a great difference how you frame an issue or reframe an issue. You can perhaps even have two parties meeting halfway by simply reframing the issue in a certain way. But again, this is Mikael's work, and I don't want to go into this any further. So instead, I think we should proceed to the next speaker then, and that would be Michael Bossetta.
Yes, again, we're very sorry that Mikael could not be with us today, but I hope you have a feeling for this knowledge or belief polarization. So that would be like anti-vaccination versus pro-vaccination and so on and so forth. So probably we would also have enjoyed having Mikael to respond to any questions, but you cannot ask him anything. So you just have to keep your questions and send him an email. But from Mikael to Michael, we're moving to Michael, who has done work on social media and politics quite extensively. And he will talk about disinformation and polarization. So, Michael, please.
Yes. Oh, cool. This works. So, I'm sure you're all familiar with the concept of the term disinformation. It's been closely connected to social media, especially in the wake of Trump and Brexit, which are often put together. And it's interesting to think about, why is disinformation so reported about? Why do we all know the term disinformation while we may not all know the term belief polarization, right? And I think what's interesting about it is there's a question of how impactful or how much of a problem is disinformation. We don't know, frankly, and that's why we're researching it. But it's interesting to think that one of the reasons disinformation may be reported about so much is because journalists are in the business of news. And so fake news is a direct threat to their interests. So they report a lot about disinformation because they are interested in it. But we actually don't know to what extent it's a problem in society. So it's interesting to think about, why do you know or you hear so much about disinformation? Because fake news is something that journalists are interested to report. And a lot of times, the narratives that journalists discuss does not match up with the science when we look at the data. I just thought to throw that out there. I think it's an interesting thing. So how many of you are familiar with these examples? Anyone? No, okay. So these are examples of Facebook pages that the Russian Internet Research Agency was spreading during the 2016 US election. And it's actually, I mean, okay, they spread some tweets, they spread some Facebook posts, but actually this is quite a clever use of social media, which is they cultivated two online audiences, well, multiple audiences, but what they would do is they would, in this case, they would take a group, what is it called? United Muslims for America. So this was a pro-Muslim group. And they would try to get people to like this page, and they would post things about, positive things about Muslims in America. Then they also created another group called the Heart of Texas, which was, in the beginning, just, Americans are very proud of Texas. Texans have their own identity. And what they would do is they would put memes out about just loving Texas. And over time, people would just like this page. They would get memes about Texas, or they'd get memes about being a Muslim in America. And then what they did, which I think is quite interesting, is they created events on each of the pages for the exact same day and the exact same time at the exact same location to put the pro-Muslims and the pro-Texans, which they could assume are anti-Muslims, together at the same space and potentially create a conflict between them. And that's what this turned out to be. If you look at more pictures of this rally, very, very few people actually showed up. This makes it look like there were more people than there are. But what this shows is a foreign interference into American democracy, which is trying to put two people against each other and cause a conflict. So you'll see these Confederate flags coming from the Texans, because they were told this was an event about breaking Texas from the United States. So to have their own nation of Texas, whereas the pro-Muslims thought that this was a celebration for a new mosque. And so just by putting them together, there was an attempt by Russian trolls funded by the Kremlin in order to create a conflict, which never really happened. It was a small event, but this is the intent of them. So this is where you hear this disinformation is sowing discord. And so if we think about that in polarization terms, that would be a good example of effective polarization, or putting two groups together and trying to create hate between them. So this is where a lot of the connection between and the dangers about disinformation started coming from. But actually, there has been a longer strain of research looking at disinformation in Sweden, which is actually quite interesting. This is a study from 2017, so it was conducted before the American election, where they looked at narratives, fake news that was promoted by Russian news outlets, RT and Sputnik, on social media. Can you think about why Sweden would be a good target for disinformation? Because it is outside of NATO, but lies very close to Russia. And so what these researchers found is that RT and Sputnik were promoting real news, but it was also mixed in with fake news about trying to persuade Swedes to be more sympathetic to Russia than to NATO, essentially. And this was mixed in with real news. And this was happening before all of this stuff about Russians in the United States elections, which is interesting. So this is potentially a global phenomenon, but what I want to point out is that it really connects to the interests of the organization that's spreading this disinformation, in this case, Russia, right? In the US, they're trying to put Muslims and anti-immigrant citizens together, whereas in Sweden, they're trying to influence narratives about NATO, right? These are two different things. In terms of what disinformation can do, again, we really don't know, but we have for a long time, for decades now in media and communication research, rejected the idea that people are shown information and they believe it. right? This is what's called the hypodermic needle hypothesis or the magic bullet hypothesis. And we know that this is not the case, right? So much of the research shows that disinformation actually doesn't work, or it only works under certain conditions. For example, if you have a low trust in government, you might believe more in disinformation. Or my research has shown that people are more likely to retweet information from a source that aligns with their identity. So black people are more likely to retweet disinformation from black people, or right-wing people are more likely to retweet information from, but they're not likely to retweet information from fake news outlets. There has to be some sort of coded identity into the account, which is quite interesting. And so I'll just, what I've been thinking about is, if we're looking to study disinformation, I mean, we know from other research that countries like Russia and Iran seek to polarize. They seek to put these tensions together. Whereas China doesn't do that. They seek to promote positive narratives about China. So it's not negative at all. It's entirely positive. And I think what's interesting is not so much looking at the effects of disinformation and what it might do to people, or whether they believe it or not. I think it's, we know that it probably doesn't work in most cases. But what's interesting is to look at when disinformation is sent to Swedes, what does that tell us about what foreign countries think will work? What can we learn by the strategies that Russians try to use in spreading disinformation? What can that tell us about Russia thinks will polarize Swedes? It's not a question, well, we can look at it as, it's not a question of whether disinformation works or not, but what does that tell us about the interests of foreign actors and what they perceive Sweden to be and what they think might work to pull Swedish society apart? So in this project that we're working on, this is going to be one thing that I'd be interested to explore, is how do these narratives reflect what foreign governments think will polarize Sweden, regardless of whether it works or not. I think we can get some good insights into international relations that way.
Thank you so much, Michael. And save all your questions for the Q&A session towards the end of our event today. So write it down and keep them alive. But we will move on to our next presenter. And our next presenter is Hanna Bäck. And she will talk about political elites and their role in polarization. Please, Hanna.
Yeah, thank you. So, as a political scientist, I'm very much interested in how representatives, politicians, and how they influence voters. So that's basically what this project is about, and how the way politicians speak can influence the voters. And we're some people in this group that actually want to study this online. And so in some of my previous work, I've studied polarization, not online, but in parliamentary debates in the Riksdag. And we have been trying to sort of measure the polarization by analyzing the speeches and seeing how different do members of parliament from the different blocs speak. And I'm showing you a figure from that shows some results from this project. You can see at the bottom of the figure we have 94 to 98 period, and then in the top we have later periods that it goes up until 2014. And at least we think that we see sort of, this is based on computerized analysis of hundreds and thousands of speeches, but it's basically showing that there is a sort of separation between the two blocks, that they become more distinct from each other. And this is, we think, is very interesting. So we see a sort of rhetorical separation between the blocks. The question is, what kind of polarization are we dealing with here? We don't really know that, because like Erik was talking about, these three different forms of polarization. It could be political polarization. It could be that you really have very different policy views in the blocks. But it could also be capturing some of this affective polarization, that you see some kind of group identities in the blocks and that they really hate each other, the two blocks. So that's what we've been trying to study. But in this program, we actually want to focus on the online polarization. That's something that we then want to apply these kind of techniques to also analyze text online, like using Twitter data and so on, to see how politicians, are they really separated in the way they speak, and are they polarizing in their language? And another question that we're interested in is also to understand why politicians would use a certain type of rhetoric. Like, are they using it to mobilize the voters, or are they, which we think that that's the case, that this is why you speak a certain way, because you want to mobilize your own group against the other group. This is from some data from a survey made with the members of parliament. It's not published yet, but it's going to come out in a book that is written about this survey that's always done after the election in Gothenburg, riksdagsundersökningen. And I hope you can see what the graph says, but it's based on a survey question where we ask the members of parliament, the MPs, how they see members of other parties. Do they see them as being thoughtful, honest, or non-prejudiced? And then you can see, if we look on the horizontal axis, this is the party that is evaluating another party then. So you can see that when the left party evaluates all the other members, they are definitely think that the Sweden Democrats are least thoughtful, least honest, and least non-prejudiced. And that's basically the case for all the parties. But there are some of the non-socialist party members that don't have exactly the same view then of the Sweden Democrats. And of course, the Sweden Democrats don't have this view of themselves. So you can see that they have other parties then, that, for example, the Left Party and the Green Party are the ones that they find to be least good character. So these kind of things we would also like to, we know that this is also going on at the voter level when we do surveys with voters. But what is the connection between the elites and the voters? Which direction does it go? Is it the elites influencing the voters, or is it the other way around? Is it the voters that actually, that the parties are just picking up what's in the electorate? So this is something that we want to study in this project. Lastly, I'm showing you some results from an experiment. Which is the type of sort of experiments we're thinking about doing in this program also. We want to then analyze how do the political elites' rhetoric actually influence this kind of effective polarization among the voters. So we have done a preliminary experiment where we have sort of fake tweets, where you use a language that's sort of threatening to the voter, especially if you have a certain view. So this is meant to be threatening to someone who's more right-wing, who might see immigration as a threat then. And then we actually see that people who are given this tweet, they are also the ones who are then more likely to have all these kinds of negative emotions. So we see some kind of emotional reaction. And we also see that those people who became angry when they read the tweet were also the ones who became more effectively polarized. So it's only through anger that this actually has an effect in this study. But this is something we want to do really a lot more on in the program, to study how do the language used by elites actually influence the voters. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hanna. Again, save all your questions about how diving deeper into any of the graphs you have seen or anything like that for later. And now, for our final presenter, I'm turning to Nils Gustafsson, who will talk about media narratives and polarization, or media narratives of polarization. So, Nils, please.
Yeah, so up until now, we have talked about how research studies polarization in society and different types of polarization. But there is an interesting relationship between how we try to describe what goes on in society and the reality itself. So in the popular debate, there has also been a lot of talk about polarization, but that is not exactly the academic debate, because the popular debate gets a lot of information from academia, from scientific reports, but then it is changed through a media narrative that is developed to make people want to read news, basically. So in one part of this project, we're more interested in how the concept of political polarization is described in the media and how it changes over the years. There are some experimental studies from the United States that show that if you read about
polarization, if you read about that society is polarized, it could make you believe that society is polarized and perhaps also make you think that, well, maybe I'm polarized as well. And Michael talked about that it's not that easy that we just see a thing and then instantly believes it. But there is something to the effect that the way that we describe and talk about society could have an effect on what actually goes on in society. So we have tried to study how the concept of political polarization has been used in the Swedish media. And what you see here is a graph showing the number of articles using the phrase polarisering, in Swedish print media from 1980 up until 2020. And as you can see, there is a certain uptick in the 2010s. And we have, you could say that, well, this is because there is an increase in the sheer volume of media content as the time goes on, but we have checked that as well. So there is a relative increase as well of the use of political polarization. And we have studied in a pilot study how the concept has been used during the 2010s. And what we can see is that in the beginning of the decade, it is used in a very specific way. It is used to describe political debates or debates about issues such as, should there be wolves in Sweden? The debate is polarized between those who want there to be wolves in the woods and those that don't want there to be wolves in the woods. And other things like that. And also to describe things that goes on in other countries, especially in US politics. So US politics is described, and the US society is described as being polarized. And then when we move closer to the end of the decade, we see that apart from the concept becoming increasingly more popular and still being used to describe American politics and the division between Democrats and Republicans, it is also increasingly used in a rather vague and general manner to describe society at large. We're living in polarized times. We're living in the world is polarized without any specific reference. So it is not anymore that the left side and the right side are polarized, or the debate in the question about the wolves is polarized, but it's also increasingly used to just in a very vague manner and not describing. And we're interested in what that does to our perception of what polarization is, apart from the academic definition, and what that does to how people, when we go out and study polarization, people are already primed, so to speak, to think that we are living in polarized times. This is just a graph to show how we are looking at the data. So we have done qualitative analysis of articles. We're also trying more computational methods. So this is a way to find out who are the people that are talked about as being polarized. And so when we look at what politicians are mentioned in relation to polarization, we can see that over the decade there is a heavy emphasis on American politicians, American presidential candidates. So the green dotted line is Donald Trump, and perhaps not surprisingly so. And then we also see at the end of the period the orange dotted line, which represents Joe Biden. Among Swedish politicians, the ones that are talked about the most in terms of political polarization is Stefan Löfven, the Prime Minister, and Jimmie Åkesson, the leader of the Sweden Democrats. And the other Swedish party leaders are way down below those two main figures. So this seems to suggest that when it comes to Swedish party politics and Swedish domestic politics, it is a matter of polarization between the Social Democrats or the government and the Sweden Democrats rather than the other opposition parties. Thank you.
You leave us hanging there. All right, thank you again. And questions, again, I remind everyone to write them down.
Yes, I think now is the section where the moderators ask a few quick questions to the panelists. And if I might start, and in the interest of time, I will just have 1 or 2 questions for each of you. So I start with you, Michael Bossetta. But you talked about disinformation. And as a philosopher, I want to know what that is. I mean, how do you define the concept of disinformation? And furthermore, how can it be operationalized in a way which admits of scientific study? Perhaps you could say a few words about what you mean by disinformation.
Yeah.
For instance, does it have to be false information or can it be true disinformation?
Yeah, so it's interesting because only in the past 5 years or so have we been talking about disinformation, but there's been a long history of propaganda. And so a lot of scholars are saying, well, we're saying disinformation, but we mean propaganda, and this has been around for 100 years. Even longer, you know. So there's actually, this is an evolving term, and I do actually wonder how useful it is, because what some people will tell you is that there's a difference between disinformation and misinformation. Misinformation is just when something is misreported by accident, when there's a typo or a wrong fact that can be corrected, whereas disinformation is the intent to deceive. However, I've recently learned that now it's no longer cool to talk about disinformation, or correct, I should say. It's moved to influence operations, and now the new term is information interference. And so it's a great, I think your question asked another question, which is, yeah, what are we talking about? Are we talking about influence operations, interference in the online ecosystem? We're still looking for definitions for these terms, but I think that fundamentally is a signal that we don't actually know what we're talking about because we don't know exactly what's happening online, precisely because Facebook's filters, for example, aren't even catching this stuff to report it. So when we study it, we're using data sets that are provided by platforms, but we know that the platforms are missing a lot of the disinformation. So whatever we're studying is an incomplete picture, which makes it more challenging.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. So I then turn to you, Nils, and I have a small question for you as well. So you showed this very interesting graph where people, I mean, it seems that people in the media are talking more and more about polarization. And you mentioned that there's some political figures that figure more in that debate than others. But I also wonder, I mean, if you go back to this idea of there being at least 3 kinds of polarization, belief polarization and affective polarization, ideological polarization. Have you looked at, or is there any way of looking at that aspect of the debate? I mean, purely by looking at the media data that you have collected?
Yeah, I think so. And it's difficult to get at with computational methods, but we try to do that in the qualitative study of a small number of articles. And there we could see that because we try to look for causes of polarization and the description of the nature of polarization, but in the media use, it is very seldom specified. So it's a general form of polarization. Sometimes you see that in the academic debate as well, and I think it is important to make a distinction so we know what we are talking about. But in the media text, it is rarely obvious whether it is affective or ideological polarization.
Thank you. I think that Anamaria, you have some questions.
Now is my turn. I have lots of questions, but I will only ask one, and then I can ask maybe more while you guys think about your questions and the people on the internet. So I start also with Michael, and I'm curious because you talk about the impact of disinformation not being very clearly analyzed. Do you think it's really worthy for all this attention that we have seen in the media, as in the example that I opened up this event with? There's a lot of hearings, congressional hearings in the US, in the European parliaments and so on, a lot of attention to Facebook and others, and a lot of critique that you promote disinformation, you allow disinformation and so on. Do you think that this critique is justified? Is it where politicians really should put their effort into kind of isolating disinformation or trying to regulate platforms? I mean, what is your opinion?
I think that there has been, there's more academic attention focused on disinformation relative to the danger it poses to society. There is so many smart people out there using public funds and using their time and energy to study in an experiment, will this change someone's opinion or not? And the research keeps coming out that disinformation doesn't move the needle that much. It doesn't drastically change people's opinion. The useful part of the research is that it tells us something deeper about how people consume media. So we know, for example, that there are certain questions you can ask people to understand how likely they are to believe conspiracy theories. And then so disinformation research can help us learn more about the psychology underpinning conspiracy theory beliefs and things like that. But there's this, just kind of departing from your question a bit, from a regulator's perspective, it's always about how do we stop this, right? How do we stop this disinformation? How do we take it down? And what research shows in the context of Islamic extremism, for example, is that when you take down accounts, when you delete them, they're more likely to become foreign fighters. They're more likely to act out and kill people, right? So just stopping the problem is usually not the answer. It may be the case that if you just stop the disinformation, people go and they shoot people with bow and arrows. You don't know. So I think there's a danger in this approach of let's just stop and clean up the environment without understanding more deeply what are the fundamental mechanisms that are driving people. It may be the case that a certain amount of disinformation is healthy to introduce skepticism into public debate.
All right, very interesting. And a question for you, Nils. We saw in the graph quite a big attention given to United States politics in the Swedish media over time and in the last decade more so. What do you think justifies this maybe out of proportion attention given to the United States in the context of polarization? What do you think that could explain those spikes in the graph? More attention to US elections even.
I think there are two explanations, one of which is that American politics is polarized, so it makes sense to talk about it in a polarized way, and American journalism also describes both the US society and American politics as being polarized. So I think that is where it comes, basically, from foreign correspondents reading US media. And then the attention given to the United States, you could say that, well, it's still the arguably most important country in the world and so on, but there is something of a love affair going on between Swedish journalists and the United States. So there is disproportionate amount of coverage of US news and US politics, and I think that could make polarization as a concept to describe politics leaking in from US politics to Swedish domestic politics.
That's an interesting borrowing effect, perhaps. All right, I stop here, even though also I'm sure both Erik and myself have other questions, and we open the floor physically first. I will come with a microphone and allow you to speak so that we can hear better. And if there are people online listening, you can use the Menti platform to type in your questions, and I will see them and be able to be your portavoce. All right, so I'm beginning to walk around.
Good afternoon. My name is Robert Johansson. I have a question to Michael Bossetta. Do you have strategies to suggest to counteract disinformation? I mean, well, there's an interesting, the short answer is I think that user reporting is a good way to do that. So to flag that this is fake, to crowdsource that from people on the platform. Because one of the interesting things, and this goes for research on disinformation, but also things like anti-Semitism and hate speech, is that researchers, they'll often report, we found 10% of this conversation was disinformation, or 10% was hate speech. But what they don't study is that whenever there is something objectionable or fake or that people don't like, there's a huge amount of people that come out against it. So in the 2016 elections with the Russian disinformation, when the Twitter representative was testifying before the Senate, He said, yes, we found disinformation on our platforms, but 8 times as many people called out that disinformation, and it received 10 times more engagement. So that's another way to think about, in terms of what the answer is, I don't think that platforms will ever be sophisticated enough to stop just because of the sheer amount of data and number of users. I mean, Facebook's at, what, 3 billion users. How can you ever control what happens there? But I think the good news is that whenever there is disinformation, people are quite active in calling it out. And that actually shows to be quite effective in stopping the effects of it.
Thank you. Any other questions from the audience? I think is first there and you're second. Going this way. Thank you.
Can I ask a question to Hanna, is it? Yeah. It was about the Twitter study that you had done. And I was wondering, do you think there would have been a difference if you used a different platform, or is it Twitter per se that... Ooh, is it echoing? Closer? Okay. Yeah, or like if somebody said it in a soft voice or in a harsh voice, like spoken instead of Twitter. Like, is it Twitter that stimulates this kind of response, or yeah? What are your thoughts on that?
My mic is on. So, I mean, in this experiment, we wanted to use that format, but it's not. That's not the main idea, and we really want to vary different things in these experiments because we don't know exactly what it is that sort of polarizes people. Is it the specific words they use, but it could actually be, like you say, tone of voice or imaging and things like that that also make things more emotional. So I think that's very interesting to study, but we haven't done much with that yet. Maybe Michael has a response also, because you're also involved in this. What we want to do with these kind of experiments.
Yeah, well, there's a certain... To answer your question, there are theories out there that suggest that this should be a relatively universal mechanism. So there will obviously be difference between the text of a tweet and a video, but there's a general idea that anger will have a certain effect, regardless, if it provokes anger in you somehow. So that is a question of how do you actually, in an experiment, activate an emotion in a person, but also do that kind of ethically, right? You don't want to get people scared for their lives. I don't think you could do that with a tweet necessarily. The idea behind this emotions research is that it's stemming from the brain. So it really shouldn't matter whether it's in a tweet or not. Of course, there's going to be some differences there, but we're trying to get at the fundamental kind of psychological mechanism behind it.
All right, thank you. And next question.
Hello, my name is Jonathan Almfjord. I'm not sure, I should probably ask this question to the research group as a whole. So I've been following some of the work by psychologists Jonathan Haidt and Jean Twenge, I believe her name is pronounced, especially regarding social media's impact on young women's mental health. And it looks super scary to me. So I guess my question is, considering what we know today and considering what you are researching, would you say that we know enough today to start, not go bananas, but like kindly recommend the parents to be extra careful with letting their kids online while very young? Thank you.
I could start, and you can fill in. I would say, like, a brief summary is that a lot of things with social media is worrying, and a lot of people feel that they're using it too much. But then again, also a lot of studies done, like the studies of mental unhealth. Some of these studies have been made in a way that that overemphasize, because they are made on people who are unwell, basically. So I would say that we don't know, and a problem with this is that the ones having the best data are the platform giants, and they're not allowing independent researchers to get hold of the data, and maybe they don't want to have any type of results out there, as we could see in the Wall Street Journal coverage of some of the internal studies that were done, and Facebook has responded to that, and they don't agree with the depictions of what goes on within the Facebook research department. But I would say that the bottom line is that we still don't know. And Anamaria mentioned Nick Clegg's answer that it's too easy to blame everything bad in society on social media. I think that we should probably blame a little of the bad things going on in the world on the social media, but it very easily gets overblown, I would say. But to come back to the main problem is that we can't get hold of good data.
Yeah, and I would just add that someone put it really well in this book called The Hype Machine that tries to understand and explain this interaction between human and machines. And basically, the author argues that social media is like taking a match and throwing it into like just amplifying our needs as humans, right? We have a sort of desire to be social. We have a desire to present ourselves a certain way. We have a desire to connect with other people. And social media just makes that process so much easier. And I think there is probably a brain sort of level of development in order to handle that. I don't think many adults can handle that very well. So I think that's one thing to think about, is that it's really just an amplification of what we kind of already seek as humans. And so there probably is a level that needs to be decided on, how old is appropriate to be able to handle some of these social pressures.
Yeah, and there's been a proposal to raise the age to join Facebook, for example, from 13 to 17. That's one of the ideas that comes from this research. We have an online question, so I'm just going to read it out. Is there any risk that anti-disinformation efforts censor valid opinions? For example, science that is true but hasn't been confirmed from the scientific community yet, so non-peer reviewed, I suppose. So I guess it's a question for Michael because it has the word disinformation in it, but anyone who maybe knowledge belief can also be included in here.
Yeah, this is a real problem, and we've seen, especially in the context of COVID and misinformation, we've seen doctors discussing prophylactic treatments like ivermectin or what's the other one?
The one with Trump an impossible
ivermectin and hydroxychloroquine.
Yeah.
And when doctors are debating this on YouTube, it's flagged as health misinformation, and they get a strike on their YouTube channel, which is essentially putting the medical expertise to relay that information to the public in the hands of YouTube. There's also an interesting dynamic, which is to think about these platforms as companies that are based out of Silicon Valley, which typically involves a left-wing ideology of people that are programming these platforms and making the decisions about them. So in the case of the January 6th sort of Capitol insurrection, the platform that Trump moved to, called Parler, was pulled offline by Amazon Web Service, the infrastructure that makes the platform work. So the platform wanted to operate, but essentially there was a group of people who said, we're going to cut this platform off, we're going to turn it off, and there's questions about whether that was ideologically motivated or not. And so I think that's something to also think about, that we think of these platforms as services that we use, but they're also behind them run by people who, I'm not saying they have an agenda, but they also they do have an agenda to stay in business. And so when they're incentivized to be more careful about not, getting on the bad side of regulators, that makes them maybe too careful about censorship. And there's a fine line to walk between censorship and free speech. I don't think the platforms really get it.
No.
So
Erik, maybe you also have some point of view about this.
Yeah, I just wanted to connect back to my earlier question to Michael about the exact meaning of disinformation and the like. I mean, already there you can see, I think we agreed that the meaning isn't crystal clear all the time. So already there you see that there is a considerable I mean, freedom of interpreting that in various ways, and that might, of course, lead you in the wrong direction sometimes.
I think it's also a politicized use of disinformation. So I believe in Russia, Navalny and his political team were accused of diffusing disinformation, even though they would be arguing on their end that their side had all the science and all the facts, right? So accusing one of using disinformation is a political act, and because we don't quite measure exactly disinformation, then it becomes a politicized term.
If you ever made a joke on April Fool's Day, you've spread disinformation.
According to this disinformation, yeah, it's a very wide definition. Any other question in the room? We have, I think I have a person there in the back. So 2 seconds. Or how do I reach? Quick and efficient. Thank you.
Yeah, so my question goes to Michael. You were mentioning this difference between Russia and China when it comes to disinformation and interfering with foreign states. And what I hear a lot about this issue is that Russia basically wrote that playbook on spreading misinformation, and then China is following it. Do you have any thoughts on that, or does China have any unique approaches or strategies?
Yeah, there's a report put out by the Stanford Internet Observatory called Telling China's Story. And they outline this in detail, where they look at Chinese disinformation in 3 different contexts, I think, like Taiwanese elections. And in the Taiwanese elections, they found some evidence that they were trying to polarize. But in most cases, what they do is they try to create fake accounts that promote positive narratives about China. And it's crazy. It's like they have all these bot networks, and they spread all these tweets, and like 1 in every 1,500 gets a like. So no one sees these tweets. But that's where I got that from. It doesn't appear that the Chinese are trying to do this same type of playbook.
Unfortunately, I don't think we have time, unless it's a very, very quick question. It's a moderately quick question. Can you make it a moderately quick question? Okay. There you go.
I'll make it really quick. It's for Nils. It's about the term polarization and how the graph that you were showing. Oh, why is it doing it with me? Or can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah?
Sure.
Okay, good. It's just echoing for me. So I was just thinking, because the other day I wrote, I'm studying conspiracy theories, and I wrote, conspiracy theories are polarizing society. And I was questioned on my empirical reference for that, which was problematic, because I didn't have one, but I've read it everywhere. So the effect has been that since I read it everywhere, I'm using it myself now. But I was thinking, can you also kind of reflect on that? Maybe we've changed our conceptualization of the term compared to the 80s, for example. Maybe they used different terms to describe the same phenomena.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, to take an example, Swedish politics in the 1980s was extremely polarized, but polarization wasn't used to describe it. I mean, it existed. I found the first use I found of the word was from the 1860s to describe Swedish domestic politics as polarized among the nobility of one problem with studying the concept is that polarization is not the only word to describe the phenomenon, but then the different concepts perhaps describe different aspects, and then finally the meaning of the concept changes over time. So it's very difficult to kind of nail down a single definition, and in the scientific debate, definitions are very important because we try to describe complex human society using words, and we do everything we can to make them specific. But in the popular debate, often polarization is used as a rhetorical term. You are polarizing. You are making the debate polarized. I'm not polarized.
It's an accusation.
Thank you very much. Yes. So I think it's time to wrap up, and I think we should thank the panelists. So thank you very much, and also the audience.